Okay. All right. Hi, it's Victoria, and I'm going to give you a little sort of shortened version of the first grade lesson in elementary in Montessori. So we tell this to first graders and any new students, and we ideally invite other children to hear it again and again so that they can continue to learn from it every year. So I don't have a couple of the things set up, so I'll just describe them as if I were showing them. I would have a little bowl of little bits of maybe paper, or I usually use the holes from a hole puncher, different kinds of paper, and a bowl of water, and I would have that first, and then I would have these charts. I have 4 charts that I'll show you throughout, and then I would have a volcano model here. So I would have the students, I would line them up like this and have the students sit in front of me, and I would ask them for this particular lesson that they allow me to tell the story without interrupting, so that I can not get too far off track, because it's a little bit of a longer story, a longer lesson, and that we'll have lots of time to explore all the questions they have at the end. We can take a few questions at the end, and then they can continue to explore. So this first story will set the stage. Oh, I'll talk about the ending at the ending, but there are 4 great stories that come after this, arguably 4 or 6, depending, maybe more, depending on how you want to frame it. But there's definitely 5. Did I say 4? There are definitely 5 that are recognized, I would say, and then arguably 7. I said 4 to 6 the first time, so ignore that. So we'll talk about the rest of them after. So I would start with this. Okay, today I'm going to tell you a story, a very old and important story, one of the most important stories that I've ever told. Ever since there have been human beings, we have wondered, how did we get here? Where did we come from? And what is making all of this happen? What is making the sun rise every morning and set every evening? What makes rain fall down instead of up? And we have all these questions. Why? Why are we here? Why is this happening? And we've always been seeking answers and wondering and imagining what could be. So people have often gone to other people who they considered older and wiser, and asked them, where did we come from? Who made all this? What are the laws that the whole universe, that the world is following? And different people had different answers. Some described one creator, God. Some described many. They gave them different features, different descriptions, and people could not really fully agree, but they were all connected in that they were seeking answers. So eventually, people developed tools like telescopes and microscopes and all kinds of things, and started to write things down and take notes and make observations about the world around them. And they came to a story that we can share, that we believe to be true, and there's evidence to support. However, the story could change, and you could be part of discovering a new part of the story or a change to the story. So we don't really know what's outside of the universe. The universe is the biggest thing that we can imagine and see and know because of our experiences and our senses. So this story today is about how the universe came to be as far as we understand it right now. So imagine a long, long time ago, before you were born and your parents were born and your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your long, 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 long ago ancestors, and before any human beings were around, and before any animals or life were around, and before even the earth was around. There was just darkness, utter, complete darkness, dark as night, so dark that if you went under the blanket and turned off all the lights, put a blanket over your head, and in the night, you would think that was bright compared to how dark it was. And it was so cold, you could get in a bathtub full of ice cubes and think it was warm compared to how chilly it was. So in the deep, dark, cold space, a little ball of energy and heat and light was floating around, and it eventually just spread out like a big sneeze, achoo, across the universe. And all these little particles started to fly around and be spread out all over the place, and some of them lumped together and some of them spread apart. And this is where I would take the bowl and I would sprinkle the particles, and you would see some of them sort of lumped together and some spread apart, and we would use those to sort of represent particles. And I would say some of the particles lumped together and formed planets in our sun and other things throughout the universe, stars, moons. And so I would point that out to them, and they would usually come around the bowl and observe. And then we would talk about, so these particles had laws that they would follow, and there were different things that they would do. So some got together and they formed solids, and they had to cling really tightly together. And some were a little bit looser and formed liquids, and some were so hot and spread out they formed gases. And not all of them formed these at the same time. They would, at different temperatures, be different things. And they clung tightly to one another, some did, and some spread apart. And when they got hot, they would spread apart and rise up. And when they got cold, they would squish together and sink down. And this was the nature of what was happening with these particles. They were following their laws, and they were just doing what they do. And through all of this swirling particles in space, our little sun was formed, and all the planets that go around the sun, including our very special planet Earth. And so there were so many things created in that time, and there's so many stars in the sky, more than you can imagine, more than sand on the beach, more than little tiny pieces of sand on the beach spread out. There were so many, and they were so far apart, so far apart that the light traveling from the stars, it gets to us so quickly, but it's traveling 186,000 miles per second to get to us. And we don't see that as it doesn't look very far, but it's so far away. Those stars are humongous. And things that were formed were so big, it's hard to imagine. But this is a picture of our sun, or an image, a drawing of our sun. And this little tiny speck right here represents how big Earth is compared to the sun. Just a tiny speck, 1/1,000,000th of the size of the sun. This can't even show that scale. So things were very big and very spread apart, and there were so many things, and among all those things that were created was our special planet Earth. And at first our Earth was so hot that it was a ball of gas. Even the rocks that we stand on were not formed yet. They weren't together. They were so hot they had to spread out and go so far apart that they were still a gas. We couldn't have stood on the Earth at that time. But the coldness of space was surrounding us, and there was a dance of the elements taking place. So as the heat, as the hot Earth, sort of, the gas started to cool down, well, it would rise up towards space, and then it would cool down and sink back down. And then all the hot air would come up or away from the surface of the Earth, up and around, and then it would sink back down as it cooled down. And so there was this cycle happening and this movement of the gases. And during this time, the crust of the Earth formed. It started to cool down and cool down and cool down and cool down and become liquids. And then it started to cool down and cool down and cool down enough that the top part, the outside part, formed a harder layer. So like a crust of a pie or the skin of an apple, a thin layer on top. And what happened was the inside was still really hot, and it still is today, and it was trying to burst out. And so when it did, our Earth was covered in volcanoes all over, and they were boiling over with hot lava coming out, bursting out of the crust like this. And I would pour the vinegar into the prepared volcano model with baking soda and some red food coloring, maybe some dish soap, and I would let it bubble over and let the oohs and ahs happen. And then I would come back to this chart. All these volcanoes and all this volcanic action was forming clouds and sending ash into the sky, which was blocking the sun and cooling things down even more. And that began a cycle. It began to rain and 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 rain. Can you imagine how much it had to rain to form all of the oceans and lakes on Earth? Everything started to cool down and calm down, but still, in all this time, there was no life on Earth, no human beings around to see any of this. And so, the rest of what happened next to our beautiful planet is a story for another day. So, the next great lesson, so basically after this, I would leave out the materials and I would allow the children to explore the bowl of particles and do the volcano model again. I would take it away to clean it up, but then I would say this will be available on the shelf and you can repeat this as long as you're able to clean it up yourself. And I would leave it out and have some books as well that are about the universe and the early stages of formations of planets, and maybe there's actually another chart that sometimes is in use that shows the planets around the sun, but it's and sometimes I would add some extra pictures, but these are the charts that I was given and taught the lesson with. Originally it was also called The Story of God with No Hands, and it was sort of a religious story. In a way, it had a little, Maria Montessori was Catholic. However, it can be told in sort of a non-traditional way, and people have rewritten the beginning and let it evolve over time. So some settings, depending on the school, might emphasize the Christian Catholic underpinning, or they, Maria Montessori herself did not, and left it a little bit more open-ended, though she did refer to a God, a creator. So, anyway, after the children are exploring that, probably the next week I would come to the next story, which is the story of life on Earth, and that is first a story, then a timeline of life on Earth. Then there's a story of human beings, and the beginning of humanity, and then two timelines that go with that. And then the next story would be either the story of numerals or the story of the alphabet, either one. I usually do the alphabet first. And then later on, I usually do the story of art and created image, and the story of music and the grand staff. And that's why I sort of mentioned that there could be arguably 7, because it's introducing all of the subjects that we study in the classroom. So this story introduces philosophical questioning, religion, in a sense, chemistry, astronomy, and later on we talk a lot about what elements do and particles do in chemistry. We have a whole chemistry curriculum, so this introduces some of those ideas, and later on I'll be doing, different combinations like mixture, suspension, solutions, for example, with first graders, and referring back to this story. Remember that particles behave in different ways, and let's look at some ways that particles behave. So there are other experiments that are related, and I may talk about those in another video, but for now I'm going to go on to the second great story.